Number 1. The Grove of the Semnones. There is a rule recorded from ancient Germania that has no parallel anywhere else in the classical world. You may not enter this forest standing up. You enter bound. A cord around the wrists, worn by every single person who crosses the tree line. And there is a second rule attached to the first. If you fall over inside the grove, you are forbidden to stand. Nobody may help you up. You roll, or you crawl, until you are out on open ground again. Our only real source is Tacitus. He wrote the Germania around the year 98 of the Common Era. Chapter 39 describes the Semnones, whom he calls the oldest and the noblest of the Suebi. Tacitus never traveled into Germania himself. Everything he reports arrived through informants, traders, and soldiers. The Semnones lived between the Elbe and the Oder rivers in what is now Brandenburg and Saxony-Anhalt. At a fixed season, delegations arrived from every people who claimed Suebic blood. This was a confederation-wide gathering point, not a village shrine. The ceremony opened with a human sacrifice. Tacitus is direct about it. The killing was public, and it was performed on behalf of the state. The Latin phrase for the entry rule is nisi vinculo legatus, unless bound by a cord. Tacitus gives a reason, and the reason is theological. The cord is an admission of inferiority. You are entering the presence of a power, and you enter as something less than free. The god is never named. Tacitus says the grove is the birthplace of the entire people, and the seat of the deity who rules over all things. And then he stops. No name. Scholars have proposed Woden, the figure who becomes Odin, or Tiwaz, an older sky god. Others think the deity was regional and did not survive into any surviving text. Rudolf Much's 1937 commentary remains the standard philological treatment, and even much could not settle it. We do know the Semnones were real. Cassius Dio, in Book 55 of his Roman History, records them submitting to Tiberius in the year 5 of the Common Era. Strabo lists them among the Suebic peoples in Book 7 of his Geography. The people are attested. The grove is not. No archaeologist has ever found it, and there is a structural reason for that. A sacred grove is defined by what was never built in it. No foundations, no walls, no floor. Cut down the trees, and the site becomes indistinguishable from any other patch of ground. What we have is indirect. Tacitus describes another grove, belonging to the goddess Nerthus in chapter 40. Alcuin's Life of Willibrord describes a Frisian grove at Fosseitsland. The bogs at Thorsberg, Illerup Odal, and Nydam have produced enormous votive deposits from wet wooded places. Tolland Man, one of the best preserved bog bodies ever recovered, was found with a plaited leather cord still around his neck. A forest that demanded self-abasement at the gate raises an obvious question. What did the other groves demand? One of them answered that question with a sword. Number 2. The Sacred Grove of Nemi. 25 kilometers southeast of Rome, in the Alban Hills, there is a volcanic crater holding a lake of about 1 2/3 square kilometers. The Romans called it Speculum Dianae, the mirror of Diana. On its northern shore stood a grove, and in that grove stood a priest, and the only way to become that priest was to kill the man currently holding the job. His title was Rex Nemorensis, King of the Wood. Strabo, in Book 5 of his Geography, lays out the mechanics. The priest was always a runaway slave. He carried a drawn sword at all times, because any challenger could arrive at any hour, and the challenge was not symbolic. There was a prerequisite. Before you could fight him, you had to break a branch from one particular tree inside the grove. This was not faded legend by the imperial period. Suetonius records that the Emperor Caligula, deciding one priest had held the post too long, hired a stronger man to go and kill him. That is a 1st century emperor, treating the succession rule as a live administrative tool. The cult was dedicated to Diana Nemorensis, alongside two obscure figures, Verbius, a woodland deity identified with the resurrected Hippolytus, and Egeria, a water nymph. Pausanias connected it to the myth of Orestes, carrying the image of Artemis from Taurus to Italy. Ovid, in Book 3 of the Fasti, describes women processing to the lake at night with lit torches, fulfilling vows, on the 13th of August. The sanctuary was substantial, a triangular terrace, roughly 200 meters by 175, with a portico, a temple, a theater, and baths. Excavation began in 1885, when Sir John Savile Lumley, the British ambassador to Italy, dug the site and shipped the finds to Nottingham. What came out complicates the story. Thousands of anatomical votives, terracotta eyes, limbs, wombs, internal organs. These are the offerings of a healing cult. People came to Nemi sick and left models of the parts they wanted fixed. The murderous priesthood and the medical pilgrimage occupied the same trees. Nemi is famous today for one reason. Sir James Fraser opened the Golden Bough with it in 1890, expanding to 12 volumes by 1915, and building a global theory of the dying and reviving king out of this one Italian grove. Classicists have abandoned that framework. The site's fame still rests on it. Caligula also built two enormous pleasure barges there, roughly 70 and 73 meters long, fitted with lead pipes stamped with his name. They lay on the bottom for 19 centuries. Mussolini partially drained the lake between 1928 and 1932 to recover them. On the night of the 31st of May, 1944, during the German retreat, both ships burned. Only fragments survive, and models at 1/5 scale. The grove is gone too. Hazelnut orchards cover the crater slopes now. Some prohibitions fail. Others are still being enforced today, and one of them can be measured with a ruler. Number 3. Mawphlang Sacred Grove. About 25 kilometers from Shillong, in the East Khasi Hills of Meghalaya in northeast India, there is a forest of roughly 75 to 80 hectares, sitting at about 1,900 meters above sea level. The Khasi call it Law Kintang, or Law Lingdo, the sacred forest. The rule here is total. Nothing leaves, not a leaf, not a twig, not a stone, not a fallen branch that is already dead and rotting on the ground. You may walk in. You may not carry anything out. Tradition holds the grove is watched by a guardian deity called Labasa, said to appear as a leopard or tiger, who punishes anyone who takes. Custodianship sits with the Lingdo clan, the hereditary priestly lineage, working alongside the village Durbar. Ritual decisions involve the sacrifice of a rooster, with the outcome read from how the bird falls. If the reading is unfavorable, the decision does not proceed. Here is why this grove matters. The rule has a physical consequence, and it is measurable. Because nothing has ever been carried out, organic matter has simply accumulated. Every leaf that fell in the last several centuries is still there, decomposing where it landed. The humus layer in places exceeds a meter in depth. That is not a legend about compliance. That is compliance, in the form of soil, that you can put a measuring tape into. The forest is subtropical broadleaf, castanopsis, oak, shima, and rhododendron, wrapped in dense epiphytic moss and orchid growth. Step out, and the landscape changes instantly. Open, grazed grassland with almost no tree cover, right up to a razor-sharp edge. Meghalaya holds between 100 and 125 documented sacred groves, covering an estimated 26 square kilometers. Scientific study began with the ecologist Madhav Gadgil and the anthropologist V.D. Vartak in the 1970s, who first argued these were functioning biodiversity refugees rather than folklore. Later work by B.K. Tiwari, S.K. Barak, and R.S. Tripathi at Northeastern Hill University quantified the network. The measurements are consistent. Higher species, richness, and higher soil organic carbon inside the boundary, and rare species persisting inside that have vanished outside, including Nepenthes casiana, the Kasi pitcher plant. There is a legal accident behind this. Colonial forest law in British India vested forests in the state and largely bypassed the Kasi Hills, which operated through autonomous chiefdoms rather than direct administration. After independence, the sixth schedule of the Constitution kept most land under clan and district council control. The groves were never nationalized, so they were never scheduled for extraction. In the clearing, there are monoliths, upright stones called Mawphlang, and flat ones called Mijikenda, part of a Kasi megalithic tradition still practiced into the modern era. The pressures now are tourism, road access, limestone and coal quarrying, and the erosion of clan authority. Guided visitors are allowed at the edge, and the guides enforce the carry-nothing rule personally. On another coastline entirely, the same basic logic produced forests you can identify from orbit. Number 4. The Mijikenda Kaya Forests. Look at satellite imagery of the Kenyan coast, and you will see something that does not look natural. Dark, roughly circular islands of dense forest, scattered across a flat expanse of pale, cleared farmland. The boundaries between the two are not gradual. They are sharp enough to trace with a fingernail. Those islands are kayas, and the boundary is not a fence. It is a council of elders. Mijikenda means 9 homesteads in Swahili, and refers to 9 related peoples of the coastal ridge: the Giriama, Digo, Duruma, Rabai, Raibi, Kambe, Jibana, Chonyi, and Kauma. Between 40 and 60 kaya forests are documented across Kwale, Kilifi, and Mombasa counties, from about 10 hectares up to over 300. Oral tradition holds the Mijikenda migrated south from a homeland called Singwaya, north of the Tana River, in roughly the 16th or 17th century, under pressure from Oromo expansion. What they built was defensive, a clearing at the center of dense forest, reached only by narrow paths, with gates that could be closed. The forest was the wall. At the center of each kaya sits the fingo, a buried talisman said to have been carried from Singwaya, holding the settlement's protective power. Authority rests with the kambi, councils of male elders, who control who enters, by which path, wearing what. Shoes come off. Hats come off. Certain paths are closed. Cutting a living tree is forbidden, and medicinal collection requires an elder's sanction. People stopped living in most kayas in the 1940s, moving out to open farmland. The prohibitions did not lapse when the residents left. The settlement ended. The rule kept running. What the rule preserved is internationally significant. These are fragments of the East African coastal forest mosaic, a global biodiversity hotspot. More than 50 recorded plant species in the kayas are rare, endemic, or threatened. The surrounding plain has been almost entirely cleared for sisal, cashew, maize, and tourism, which is why the kayas stand out so violently from above. The documentation came from the botanist Anne Robertson and the ecologist Quentin Luke, whose coastal forest survey in the late 1980s and early 1990s established what was inside. In 1992, the National Museums of Kenya set up a coastal forest conservation unit to work with the elders. Then came a clever legal move. From 1992, kayas were gazetted as national monuments under Kenya's Antiquities and Monuments Act, not forestry law, heritage law. They were protected as cultural sites, which routed around the weaknesses of environmental protection entirely. In 2008, 11 kaya sites were inscribed by UNESCO. The threats are land subdivision, tourism development, charcoal burning, and prospecting for titanium and iron ore. But researchers identify a different risk as sharpest. The elder councils are aging, and transmission to younger generations is faltering, A forest protected by an idea lasts exactly as long as the idea does. Kaya Kinondo in Kweli County opened a controlled community ecotourism scheme in 2001. You enter with an elder, you wear a black cloth, and you follow every rule. Elsewhere, an institution decided that the safest protection was not a rule at all. It was silence. Number 5. The Methuselah Grove. High in the White Mountains of eastern California, at around 3,000 meters, in the ancient bristlecone pine forest of the Inyo National Forest, stands a tree called Methuselah. You can visit the general area. You cannot find the tree, because the United States Forest Service will not tell you where it is. It appears on no map, no trail sign, no interpretive panel. Rangers will not confirm it if you point at a candidate. To understand why, you need to know what happened to a tree called Prometheus. The species is Pinus longiva, the Great Basin bristlecone pine, formerly separated from its Rocky Mountain relative by Dana K. Bailey in 1970. Methuselah was dated by Edmund Schulman, working with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. He published in National Geographic in March of 1958, giving the tree a germination date of roughly 2833 before the Common Era, about 4,850 years old. Schulman died that same year, at 49, only months after the article that made these trees famous. In August of 1964, a graduate student named Donald Curry was working on Wheeler Peak in the Snake Range of eastern Nevada, sampling a bristlecone cataloged as WPN 114 and nicknamed Prometheus. His increment borer failed. With Forest Service permission, the tree was cut down so the rings could be counted directly. The count came back at a minimum of 4,862 rings. Because bristlecones at that elevation frequently fail to produce a ring in a bad year, the real age was almost certainly over 4,900. Prometheus was older than Methuselah, and Prometheus was now firewood. The case is still taught in dendrochronology and conservation ethics courses, and the secrecy around Methuselah hardened permanently afterwards. There may be an older one. Tom Harlan cross-dated a White Mountains tree at roughly 5,070 years, but died in 2013 before publishing, so the claim sits unresolved. How does a tree live for 5 millennia? By growing on dolomite. The substrate is alkaline, high in calcium and magnesium, and hostile to almost everything else, which removes competition. Growth rings can be thinner than 1/10 of a millimeter. The wood is so dense and resinous it resists rot, insects, and fungus for thousands of years after death. Most of an old bristlecone's trunk is dead, with a single narrow strip of living bark carrying water up one side. That last property changed archaeology. Because dead bristlecone wood survives on the ground for millennia, C.W. Ferguson built a continuous, year-by-year chronology stretching back past 8,000 years. Compared against radiocarbon dates from the same wood, it exposed a systematic offset. Radiocarbon years and calendar years were not the same thing. Hans Suess formalized the correction in the 1960s. Recalibrated dates showed European megalithic monuments were older than the Near Eastern structures they had been assumed to imitate. Colin Renfrew called it the Second Radiocarbon Revolution, and it demolished the diffusionist model of European prehistory. The trees now face white pine blister rust, mountain pine beetles moving upslope as the climate warms, and fire at elevations that historically almost never burned. In Nigeria, a forest survived by exactly the opposite method, not secrecy, a priesthood, in public. Number 6. The Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove. On the banks of the Osun River, at the edge of Osogbo in southwestern Nigeria, there are about 75 hectares of dense riparian forest. UNESCO's assessment contains a sentence worth sitting with. This is the last intact example of something that once existed at the edge of every Yoruba town. The grove belongs to Osun, Orisha, of fresh water, fertility, healing, and prosperity. The founding tradition says Osogbo was established after the Osun spirit granted permission to the founder Laruye and the hunter Olatimahin, on condition the riverbank be respected. The town has kept that condition for centuries. Inside there are around 40 shrines and 9 principal worship points along the water. The Ataoja, traditional ruler of Osogbo, remains chief custodian. The Iya Osun is senior priestess. Protection is not fencing. It is prohibition. No fishing in the sacred stretch. No hunting. No felling. Every year, for 12 days in July and August, the grove hosts the Osun-Osogbo festival. It culminates in the procession of the Arugba, a votary virgin from the royal family who carries the sacrificial calabash on her head to the river. She walks in silence, her face partly covered. The crowd may not touch her. The grove nearly did not survive the 20th century. Missionary pressure, colonial administration, and simple neglect had left many shrines decaying. What reversed it was, improbably, an Austrian artist. Suzanne Wenger was born in Graz in 1915. She arrived in Nigeria in 1950, settled in Osogbo, was initiated into Yoruba religion, and took the name Aduni Olorisha. From the late 1950s, she led the new sacred art movement, working with local artists including Adebisi Akanji, Buraimo Gbadamosi, and Saka. What they built is unlike anything in earlier Yoruba architecture. Monumental cement and iron sculptures, undulating organic forms, entire shrine structures raised where old ones had collapsed. The Iya Mupo Shrine, the Busanyan Shrine, the ornate first gateway. They did not restore the grove so much as repopulate it, in a new idiom the community accepted as legitimate. Wenger died in Osogbo in January of 2009 at 93. The grove was declared a national monument in 1965 and inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2005. Ecologically, it holds mature closed canopy forest with over 400 recorded plant species, roughly 200 with documented medicinal use. White-throated monkeys and colobus live in the canopy. Crocodiles and fish in the river are ritually protected, which functions as an enforced no-take zone. The threats are the ordinary ones: illegal logging at the boundary, an expanding city pressing on a small forest, poaching, and, awkwardly, the festival, which now draws crowds in the hundreds of thousands into a 75-hectare space. Osun-Osogbo survived because nobody powerful enough ever decided to destroy it. Another set of groves was not so lucky, and we know about them only because an army wrote up its own work. Number 7. The Druid Groves of Mona. In the year 60 or 61 of the Common Era, Roman infantry crossed the Menai Strait in flat-bottomed boats, while the cavalry forded or swam alongside their horses. Their target was Mona, the island now called Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales. Tacitus describes what they saw waiting on the far shore in Book 14 of the Annals. A line of armed defenders. Women in black robes running between the ranks with torches, hair loose and wild. And behind them the Druids, hands raised, pouring out curses. Tacitus says the Roman soldiers stopped. They stood there, exposed, until their commander Suetonius Paulinus shamed them into moving forward. Then they won, garrisoned the island, and cut down the groves. Tacitus gives the justification in the next breath. The groves, he writes, were dedicated to savage rites and drenched with the blood of prisoners, and the Britons considered it lawful to consult the gods by reading human entrails. The campaign did not last. Boudica had risen in the east, and Suetonius Paulinus marched away immediately. A second assault came around 77 or 78 of the Common Era under Agricola, when auxiliaries crossed the strait by swimming, without boats. The Celtic word for a sacred grove was nemeton. It survives in place names across the Celtic world, from Nemetobriga in Spain to Vernemetum in Britain, to Drunemeton in Galatia. Whatever these places were, there were a great many of them. What we know about the Druids comes almost entirely from Romans. Pliny the Elder describes mistletoe cut from an oak with a golden sickle and 2 white bulls sacrificed. Julius Caesar, in Book 6 of the Gallic War, says Druidic doctrine was believed to have originated in Britain, and that students memorized verses for up to 20 years without writing them down. Lucan describes Caesar felling a sacred grove near Massilia, his soldiers refusing to swing until Caesar struck the first tree himself. Every one of those authors wrote for a Roman audience about a people Rome was conquering. There is no Druidic text, and no grove archaeology has confirmed anywhere, for the same reason the Semnones Grove is invisible. Untouched trees leave no foundations. Anglesey did produce one extraordinary find. In 1942, during construction at the airfield at RAF Valley, workers uncovered the Lynn Carrig-Bosch hoard. Around 150 metal objects deposited into a lake or bog between roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. Swords, spearheads, shield fittings, chariot components, cauldrons, and 2 iron slave gang chains. Those chains are the closest thing to physical evidence touching Tacitus's prisoner claim, and they are ambiguous. They prove captivity existed. They do not prove what happened to the captives. There is a simpler reading of the campaign. Anglesey had copper at Paris Mountain, worked since the Bronze Age, and it was a significant grain producer. Miranda Aldhouse Green and Ronald Hutton have both argued the Grove accounts blend real observation with atrocity propaganda that justified taking a resource-rich island. One forest was destroyed even more completely than Mona. Its story survived because someone wrote it down 4,000 years ago. Number 8. The Cedar Forest of Humbaba. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a forest mortals are forbidden to enter. It is the dwelling of the gods. Its guardian is Humbaba, appointed by the god Enlil, with a roar like a flood, a mouth of fire, and breath that kills, wrapped in 7 auras of terror that must be stripped away one by one. Gilgamesh and Enkidu go anyway. They kill Humbaba. They cut down the tallest cedar in the forest and float it downriver to make a monumental door for the temple at Nippur. And then Enkidu dies, and the epic is explicit that the gods killed him for it. That is, as far as anyone can tell, the oldest deforestation narrative in human literature. A forbidden forest, a guardian killed, timber taken, and a punishment that arrives as mortality itself. The standard version is attributed to Sinleki Unini, compiled roughly between 1300 and 1000 before the Common Era from older Sumerian material. It came back into the world from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, excavated by Austin Henry Layard, and Hormuzd-Rassam from 1849. George Smith announced his translation of the Flood Tablet in December of 1872. The text is still growing. In 2011, the Suleymaniya Museum in Iraq acquired a fragment of Tablet 5, published in 2014, by Farouk Al-Rawi and Andrew George. It added about 20 unknown lines describing the forest as a soundscape: monkeys calling, cicadas, birdsong, and Enkidu expressing regret. The forest stops being scenery and becomes an ecosystem the characters recognize they are destroying. The real tree is Cedrus libani, reaching 40 meters with trunk diameters over 2.5 meters. For 3,000 years, it was the premier export of the Levantine coast, and the documentation of its removal is exceptionally complete. The Palermo stone records 40 shiploads of cedar arriving in Egypt under the 4th dynasty King Sneferu, around 2600 before the Common Era. Mummification used cedar resin. Coffins and funerary boats used cedar wood. 1 Kings, chapter 5, records Solomon's timber treaty with Hiram of Tyre and the tens of thousands of laborers involved. Assyrian kings from Tiglath-Pileser I recorded cedar-cutting expeditions in their royal inscriptions as acts of imperial prestige, not apology. By the Roman period, the resource was scarce enough to require protection. Hadrian had imperial forest boundaries in Lebanon marked with inscribed stones. Over 200 have been catalogued, the first identified by Louis Lortet in 1881. A forest, a Bronze Age epic called Limitless, was, by the 2nd century of the Common Era, being fenced in with legal boundary posts. What is left is small. The Horsh Ards El Rab, the Forest of the Cedars of God at Bashari, contains roughly 375 trees across about 100 hectares. It is walled and gated, with regulated access, inscribed by UNESCO in 1998 along with the Kadisha Valley. Some trees are estimated at over 1,000 years old, with contested claims of 2,000. The current threats are the cedar web spinning sawfly, wildfire, snow damage, and a viable growing zone migrating uphill on a mountain of finite height. One culture found a way out of this problem. It decided the forest and the building were the same object. Number 9. The Sacred Forest of Jingu. At Jingu in Mie Prefecture, Japan, a visitor walks up a wide gravel path between enormous cryptomeria cedars, reaches a plain, unpainted wooden fence, and stops. Beyond it, you can see a roofline. That is all you will ever see. The innermost precinct is open to priests and members of the imperial family, and nobody else. The complex has 2 main parts about 6 kilometers apart. The Naiku, the inner shrine, dedicated to Amaterasu Omikami, sun deity and mythic ancestor of the imperial line, and the Geku, dedicated to Toyuke Omikami, deity of food and agriculture. Tradition places the Naiku's founding around the year 4 before the Common Era, when the princess Yamato-hime was guided to the Isuzu River. Historians date the institution to the 7th century of the Common Era. Inside is the Yata no Kagami, the sacred mirror, one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan. It has never been publicly displayed. There is no photograph, no drawing, and no description of it in any accessible record. The shrine forest covers roughly 5,500 hectares, most of it closed. But the reason for the closure is not primarily secrecy. It is arithmetic. Every 20 years, the shrine buildings are completely rebuilt. This is the Shikinen Sengu. An identical structure goes up on an adjacent plot. The deity is transferred, and the old building is dismantled. This has happened roughly 62 times, most recently in 2013. The first is traditionally dated to the year 690 under Empress Jito, so the cycle has run for over 13 centuries, interrupted only once, for about 120 years, during the Onin War and the Sengoku period. The buildings use the Shinmei Zukuri style. Raised floor, unpainted hinoki cypress, thatched roof, forked chiji finials at the gable ends, cylindrical katsuogi logs across the ridge. No nails. The joinery is entirely wooden, and every component is replaced. Each rebuilding consumes between 10,000 and 13,000 hinoki cypress logs at a cost in the tens of billions of yen. Nothing is wasted. The old timber goes to shrines across Japan, and the torii gates at the Uji Bridge are made from the previous shrine's central pillars. By the medieval period, the shrine's own forests were exhausted, and timber came from Kiso in Nagano Prefecture. So in 1923, the shrine did something with few parallels. It began a 200-year forest management plan to make its own forests self-sufficient in hinoki again. 200 years. 10 rebuilding cycles. Every person who approved that plan knew with certainty that they would never see it complete. The first logs from that program were used in the 2013 rebuilding, 90 years after planting. Before any tree is cut, the Yamaguchi-sai and Konomoto-sai ceremonies ask permission of the mountain and tree deities. The forest is also the watershed for the Isuzu River, which runs through the Naiku precinct and is used for ritual purification. The last forest on this list was closed for a much less noble reason. Kings wanted it for themselves. That selfishness preserved something irreplaceable. Number 10. The Białowieża Strict Reserve. On the border between Poland and Belarus lies roughly 1,500 square kilometers of forest, about 600 on the Polish side. It is the largest surviving remnant of the primeval lowland forest that once covered the European plain. Białowieża National Park occupies about 105 square kilometers, and inside it sits the strict protection area, between 47 and 60 square kilometers, which you may only enter with a licensed guide on a designated route. It survives because of hunting. From the 15th century, the forest was a royal preserve under the Polish kings and Grand Dukes of Lithuania. Sigismund I and his successors issued decrees restricting hunting and settlement, with severe penalties for poaching. After the partitions, the forest passed to the Russian Tsars, who kept the arrangement exactly as it was. Alexander II hunted there. So did Nicholas II, from a purpose-built hunting palace raised in the 1890s and destroyed in 1944. The animal at the center of all of it is Bison bonasus, the European bison, which survived in Białowieża in the wild longer than anywhere else on the continent. Then it did not. The last wild Białowieża bison was shot by a poacher in February of 1921. The last wild Caucasian bison died in 1927. Reintroduction began in 1929 from captive animals. Every European bison alive today descends from a founder population of about 12 individuals, one of the most severe documented bottlenecks in any recovered large mammal. There are now several hundred on each side of the border and over 6,000 worldwide. What makes Białowieża scientifically irreplaceable is not the bison. It is the dead wood. Around 40% of the forest's total wood volume is dead or decaying, standing or fallen where it collapsed. In a managed forest, that material is removed. Here, it never has been, and it supports an entire biological layer that has been erased almost everywhere else in Europe. The inventories are extraordinary. Roughly 1,020 vascular plant species, over 4,000 fungi, around 12,000 invertebrates, including saproxylic beetles that can only live in standing deadwood, birds requiring old-growth structure, the white-backed woodpecker, the three-toed woodpecker, the pygmy owl, oaks over 400 years old exceeding 40 meters, Norway spruce over 50 meters, unusually tall for the species. The Polish side was inscribed by UNESCO in 1979, extended to the Belarusian side in 1992, and extended again in 2014. Then came a fight. A severe spruce bark beetle outbreak began in 2012. In 2016, the Polish Environment Ministry approved roughly tripling the logging allowance in the managed portion, arguing the forest had to be treated. Conservation scientists argued the outbreak was exactly the natural process a strict reserve exists to record. In April of 2018, the European Court of Justice ruled the logging violated European Union environmental law under the Habitats and Birds directives. Since 2021, a steel border wall has gone up along the Belarusian sector, built for reasons unrelated to forestry, fragmenting the movement of bison, lynx, and wolf across a habitat continuous for millennia. 10 forests, 10 different mechanisms, one pattern underneath all of them. Look at the 10 together, and only 4 mechanisms are in play. Ritual taboo covers Mawphlang, the Kaya forests, Osun-Osogbo, Isi, and the Semnones. Royal privilege covers Białowieża and, in a stranger register, Nemi. Deliberate secrecy has exactly one case, Methuselah. Modern legal designation arrived late and was layered on top of the others at the Kayas, Osun-Osogbo, Białowieża, and Bishari. They look nothing alike. Functionally, they are identical. Everyone raises the cost of entering, high enough that entering becomes rare. Ritual taboo is the most efficient of the 4, because it needs no guard. A fence requires patrolling. A taboo is enforced by everyone who believes in it, all the time, including when nobody is watching. That is why elder councils and priesthoods outperformed fences for so long, and why their decline is the most serious threat these sites face. The evidence that it worked is physical. a metre of humus at Mawphlang, a satellite visible boundary at the Kayas, 40% deadwood volume at Białowieża, 400 plant species inside 75 hectares at Osogbo. These are not claims about the past. They are measurements taken in the present. The failures are just as instructive. Nemi and Mona collapsed under imperial power, quickly and completely. The cedar forest failed slowly, over 3,000 years of legal, profitable, meticulously documented logging. Prometheus failed in a single afternoon, at the hands of a permitted researcher with good intentions and a broken tool. There is an irony running through it. Protection almost never came from anything resembling conservation. Kings wanted game. Priests wanted purity. Czars wanted a private hunting ground. The old growth structure was a side effect nobody aimed at. Most of these forests are small, and that is not an accident. A prohibition is a local instrument, enforced by a specific community over a specific area, and it holds only as long as that community holds. Which raises a question about what the boundary does to our ability to study what is inside it. A forest nobody enters is, from a research perspective, an uncontaminated control plot. Sacred groves in India and Kenya are now used as reference ecosystems, defining what restoration in those regions should aim at. The difficulty is obvious. How do you study a place you may not enter, or from which you may remove nothing? The answer has been a whole methodology built around the constraint: transect counting instead of collecting, photography and acoustic monitoring instead of specimens, remote sensing and LiDAR at the Kayas, making boundaries measurable to the meter without anyone stepping across them. At Mawphlang, taking a sample is not a procedure. It is a negotiation with a clan. Białowieża is Europe's baseline for what unmanaged lowland forest looks like, which is why the bark beetle fight was so bitter. If the reserve exists to record natural processes, an outbreak is data, not damage. Dendrochronology sits at the opposite extreme because the science requires taking wood out of the tree. Increment boring is the non-destructive standard, and it almost always works. Prometheus is the case where it did not. What that science bought was a calendar-accurate calibration curve extending past 8,000 years, which corrected every radiocarbon date in the discipline. Ice is a subtler version of the problem. A forest managed on a 200-year plan is one of the longest silvicultural experiments ever run, conducted inside a religious institution rather than a research one. Cedar research at Bishari is constrained by a surviving population so small every tree is precious. Bison genetics benefited from an unusually complete stud book, which is why that bottleneck is so well characterized. There is an uncomfortable asymmetry here. We know the most about the forests that were destroyed, because destruction generates documents. Tacitus on Mona is the fullest surviving description of any ancient grove in northern Europe, and it exists only because his countrymen cut it down and needed to explain why. A prohibition that succeeds produces no excavation, no samples, no publications. It produces silence. Some unknown portion of the ancient world is invisible to us by design. The list of open questions is longer than the list of settled ones. The god of the Semnones has no name in any surviving source. No site has ever been confirmed as their grove. We do not know whether the binding rite was symbolic submission or literal temporary enslavement, or whether Tacitus's informant described one real ceremony or a composite. At Nemi, we do not know whether succession by combat was still literal in Strabo's day or already ceremonial. We do not know what the golden bough was. Mistletoe is Fraser's identification, not something the ancient sources state. And we do not know whether the healing cult and the armed priesthood belong to the same phase of the sanctuary. The Meghalaya groves have no absolute dates. We know they are old. We cannot say how old. Whether the Kaya migration from Singwaya Is history, charter myth, or history compressed into myth, remains genuinely unresolved. The true age of the oldest bristlecone is unsettled, because Harlan's 5,070-year claim was never fully documented, and because nobody knows how many rings are missing from sequences taken at extreme elevation. No Druidic grove has ever been identified archaeologically, and the Lyn Carrig Bach gang chains remain ambiguous evidence of a practice we cannot reconstruct. The original extent of the Lebanon cedar forest is estimated rather than mapped, and it is not certain whether the Bishari trees are a relict of the ancient forest or a later regeneration. The founding date of Ise is disputed, its earliest cult unclear, and the Yata no Kagami has never been examined by anyone who has written about it. At Białowieża, it is not certain the forest was ever truly unlogged before the 15th century, and whether the beetle outbreak fell within the historical range of variation is exactly the question the reserve was created to answer, and cannot yet. Then there is the question none of these can address. How many groves existed and left no trace whatsoever, because leaving no trace was the entire point? Every one of these places has a current status, and most are contested right now. At Mawphlang, tourism revenue helps underwrite the grove and is also the pressure on it, while limestone and coal quarrying advance across Kasi land more broadly. On the Kenyan coast, land subdivision and titanium prospecting press on Kaya boundaries, while every recent survey identifies the aging elder councils as the sharper long-term risk. Kayakinondo's controlled access scheme is the one model that appears to work. At Osun-Osogbo, festival attendance now runs into the hundreds of thousands, funneled into 75 hectares, while illegal logging works the boundary and the city expands against it. In California, white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle are moving upslope as temperatures rise, and fire has begun reaching elevations that historically almost never burned. The Shulman Grove Visitor Center burned in 2008 and was rebuilt in 2012. The trees were unharmed. At Bishari, the sawfly infestation continues. Snow damage is recurrent, and the viable growing zone keeps migrating uphill on a mountain that does not get any taller. At Ise, the 200-year timber plan is now 90 years in and has delivered its first logs. The next Shikinen Sengu is scheduled for the early 2030s, and the trees for it are already standing. At Białowieża, the 2018 European Court of Justice ruling was a rare and decisive legal win. 3 years later came a steel border wall cutting a corridor, continuous since the last glaciation, fragmenting bison, lynx, and wolf populations for reasons that have nothing to do with any of them. At Nemi, there are hazelnut orchards, a lake that was drained and refilled, and 2 burned ships. At Mona, there is no grove, no site, and 1 hostile paragraph. The pattern in the present looks like the pattern in the past. Sites with living custodians are doing better than sites that have only laws. Go back to the image this started with. A man walking into a forest with his wrists bound, because the alternative is not walking in at all. Strip away the theology and look at what that rule was doing. It was making entry expensive. Expensive enough to be rare. Every site on this list found some way to do that, and the methods have almost nothing in common. A chain at the treeline, a sword in the hand of a man who cannot sleep, a prohibition on carrying anything out, an elder who must give permission, a map that was never drawn, a royal decree backed by a hangman, a wall and a gate, a priesthood that never lapsed, 8 different instruments, 1 function. The forests still standing are the ones where somebody is still enforcing the rule. The forests that fell are the ones where the enforcer was outmatched by an army, by an axe, or by a market that wanted cedar more than the forest. Humbaba's forest took 4,000 years to become 375 trees behind a wall. Prometheus took 1 afternoon. There are 2 uncomfortable observations sitting inside this. The best preserved forests were mostly protected by people who wanted them for hunting, and the most complete descriptions we have were mostly written by the people who destroyed them. That meter of leaf litter at Mawphlang is worth one more thought. It is not a measurement of soil. It is a measurement of generations of restraint, deposited one autumn at a time, by people who each chose not to pick anything up. The sharp edge of a kaya visible from orbit is not a measurement of vegetation. It is the exact physical boundary of an idea, which suggests these are not places where something is hidden. They are places where something was left alone, and leaving alone turns out to be an active, expensive decision renewed continuously, by every generation, forever. When these systems failed, the forest had not changed. The agreement had. A prohibition is only ever as old as its youngest believer. In 1923, the custodians of Ise planted trees for a building that would not be constructed until long after every one of them was dead. That is the whole thing in a single act. These forests are the physical record of the longest promises human beings have ever managed to keep.